The following podcast contains mature themes and is intended for an adult audience. Listener discretion is advised. In this episode of Summa Made Simple, we shall be looking at the third article of question 152, which poses the question whether virginity is a virtue. What I found really interesting here was the reply to the second objection, which drops a number of pearls of wisdom with respect to virtue in general. Let's get into it. We proceed thus to the third article. Objection 1. It would seem that virginity is not a virtue, for no virtue is in us by nature. Or as the philosopher says in Ethics Book 2, Chapter 1, now, virginity is in us by nature, since all are virgins when born. Therefore, virginity is not a virtue. So here he's speaking about the fact that when a baby is born, obviously that baby is a virgin. Now, there's no way on earth that a virtue can be in every single human being across the board always. That just kind of, falls away from the very definition of what a virtue is in terms of a stable disposition towards the good, because in that sense, then there'd be no vicious people who have vices. So it therefore stands to reason that virginity is not a virtue, because at some stage, every single human being has it. Objection 2. Further, whoever has one virtue has all virtues, as stated above in a previous article, yet some have other virtues without having virginity. Else, since none can go to the heavenly kingdom without virtue, no one could go there without virginity, which would involve the condemnation of marriage. Therefore, virginity is not a virtue. In other words, because if someone has one virtue, someone has all the virtues, yet we know that there are some people who have virtues, even to a heroic degree without that virtue of virginity, and yet they're in heaven. That's a contradiction. It therefore means that virginity is not a virtue, because these people are in heaven and they did not practice virginity here on earth like married couples, etc. So virginity is not a virtue. Objection number 3. Further, every virtue is recovered by penance, but virginity is not recovered by penance. Wherefore Jerome says, other things God can do, but he cannot restore the virgin after her downfall. Therefore, seemingly virginity is not a virtue. In other words, every single virtue, every time we commit a sin, remember St. Thomas uses the word vice and sin interchangeably, which is very interesting. Maybe one day we'll get to that conversation. But the point is that every single virtue can be, once lost, can be recovered through penance, through confession, through making up for it. But virginity cannot be recovered by penance. Once a person has lost their virginity, it's gone for good. It's over. They can't get it back. Therefore, virginity is not a virtue, because all virtues can be recovered through penance. Objection 4. Further, no virtue is lost without sin, yet virginity is lost without sin, namely by marriage. Therefore, virginity is not a virtue. And objection 5. Further, virginity is condivided with widowhood and conjugal purity. But neither of these is a virtue. Therefore, virginity is not a virtue. On the contrary, Ambrose says in his essay on virginity, Chapter 1, Section 3, love of virginity moves us to say something about virginity, lest by passing it over, we should seem to cast a slight on what is a virtue of high degree. And if St. Ambrose says that virginity is a virtue of high degree, then virginity is a virtue of high degree. St. Thomas's answer, I answer that, as stated above in Article 1. The formal and completive element in virginity is the purpose of abstaining from venereal pleasure, which purpose is rendered praiseworthy by its end, insofar, to wit, as this is done in order to have leisure for divine things, while the material element in virginity is integrity of the flesh, free of all experience of venereal pleasure. What does he mean by this? This is a very important concept to grasp, and he's repeating it again. And it's that idea of the form and the matter of a virtue. So, do you remember when we were speaking about, I forget which topic it was exactly, what article it was exactly, but we're speaking about how you can have 5 or 6 statues of Bugs Bunny. And one is made of wood, one is made of silver, one is made of plastic, one is made of clay. Now, in terms of the form, they're all exactly the same statue of Bugs Bunny, but in terms of the matter, what it's made of, they're completely different. One is wood, one is plastic, one is clay, one is copper, one is silver, etc. So, using that as an analogy to understand this, this is what he means in terms of the formal completive element in virginity is the purpose of abstaining from venereal pleasure, which purpose is rendered praiseworthy by its end, insofar to wit as this is done in order to have leisure for divine things. In other words, the shape of virginity, the shape of this virtue called virginity, is something inside of our minds which directs us towards the good, insofar as this element, sexual pleasure, is involved. Now, that will actually relate it to other things which are also directed towards the good. And that means they all have kind of the same shape. They are formally related. It's like these different statues of the same thing. But the matter is different. The matter here is integrity of the flesh. He'll unpack that shortly. Now, it is manifest that where a good action has a special matter, through having a special excellence, there is a special kind of virtue. For example, magnificence, which is about great expenditure, is for this reason a special virtue distinct from liberality, which is about all uses of money in general. So, in other words, remember we spoke about magnificence and liberality when we were speaking about the virtue of, I think it was fortitude. We were speaking about the virtue of fortitude. Magnificence fell under fortitude. It was one of the parts of fortitude. And we're saying both of them have to do with money, with using money for something good. So formally, they have the same form. But then in terms of the matter, liberality, so for instance, the story of the incident in the Bible of the widow who was at the temple, and then Jesus was sitting at the temple and he was looking at people putting money into the collection box, and then he saw this woman come and she put in a very small amount, and then she walked away, and he told his apostles she put in more than all the others. Why is that? Because even though materially, what she practiced, what she put in was a tiny, tiny bit, formally, in terms of the intention, in terms of the shape that her mind gave that action, was greater than all the other people in terms of the shape their minds gave their action, was far greater than what all those other people gave. So that's so even though her action was one of liberality, not magnificence, the two actions are actually formally related, but the matter is different. Now, to keep oneself free from the experience of venereal pleasure has an excellence of its own, deserving of greater praise than keeping oneself free from inordinate venereal pleasure. Wherefore, virginity is a special virtue, being related to chastity, as magnificence to liberality. So, in other words, magnificence and liberality both have to do with using money for something that is good. When it comes to chastity, chastity has to do with using sexual pleasure for something that is good. However, now in the same way magnificence and liberality differ in terms of their matter. One has to do with normal expenses, normal amounts of money. The other has to do with great, huge amounts of money. Same thing with the difference between virginity and marital continence. So both of them have to do with chastity, right? But virginity is greater in terms of it's abstaining from all sexual pleasure for the sake of the contemplation of divine realities. That is why it is a different virtue than marital continence, because it has to do with a far greater excellence, similarly to liberality and magnificence. Reply to objection 1. In this, he underlines and emphasizes that idea of the form of the virtue of virginity. Remember, the objection 1 said everyone is born a virgin. So, and there is no such thing as a virtue which everyone is born with. So you can't say virginity is a virtue. So virginity is not a virtue. St. Thomas clarifies that men have from their birth that which is material in virginity, namely integrity of the flesh. and freedom from venereal experience. But they have not that which is formal in virginity, namely the purpose of safeguarding this integrity for God's sake, which purpose gives virginity its character of virtue. So again, that idea, and he's linking many ideas here, things which he had mentioned in previous articles. The form of a virtue has to do with intention, the purpose that a person is aiming at internally, the choice, the deliberate choice that they are aiming at, and this is what all the moral virtues have in common. In fact, this is a very definition of morality, the life of the will, what the will intends. This is what makes a virtue a virtue. It depends on what the will intends. This is what gives shape to our actions and makes them virtues or vices. And he's going to expound on that just a little bit later in reply to objection 2. Objection 2 said further, whoever has one virtue has all virtues as stated above, yet some have other virtues without having virginity. For instance, married people, they don't have virginity, but they've got a lot of other virtues. So you can't therefore say that virginity is a virtue, because we had said earlier that if someone has one virtue, they have all virtues. That's actually a very good objection, and St. Thomas gives a lengthy explanation or rebuttal to that, or reply to that objection. This is what he says. Virtues are connected together by reason of that which is formal in them, namely charity. That's really important. All the virtues are formally connected in terms of their ultimate intention, their ultimate end. Remember, we said when we speak about the good of reason, the good of reason refers to two things. Number one, internally in your mind, choosing the correct end, and internally in your mind, choosing the correct means to achieve that end. Those two things, that dynamic duo, is what the good of reason implies. This is what St. Thomas is alluding to here. He says, virtues are connected together by reason of that which is formal in them, namely charity. So he is referring to that ultimate goal. All the virtues have the same ultimate goal, same ultimate shape, which is love of God, love of neighbor. That's the ultimate intention that renders an action or a stable disposition a virtue. Why is it there? Because of love of God or love of neighbor. That's what he means when he says they're formally connected. Or, here's the second part, by reason of prudence, as stated in a previous question. And this now alludes to choosing the correct means to achieve that love of God or love of neighbor. Good of reason, dynamic duo, and correct means. Correct end, love of God, love of neighbor. Correct means prudence. This is what unites all the virtues together. But not by reason of that which is material in them. For nothing hinders a virtuous man from providing the matter of one virtue and not the matter of another virtue. Thus, a poor man has the matter of temperance, but not that of magnificence. It is in this way that one who has the other virtues lacks the matter of virginity, namely the aforesaid integrity of the flesh. Nevertheless, he can have that which is formal in virginity, his mind being so prepared that he has the purpose of safeguarding this same integrity of the flesh, should it be fitting for him to do so, even as a poor man may be so prepared in mind as to have the purpose of being magnificent in his expenditure, were he in a position to do so. Or again, as a prosperous man is so prepared in mind as to purpose bearing misfortune with an equal mind, with equanimity, without which preparedness of the mind no man can be virtuous. What does he mean by this? Let's use an analogy. He's referring to the difference between the inner workings and the outer workings of a human being, and he's saying that virtue formally, the form of virtue, resides in the inner workings of a human being, the deliberate choice, the deliberate intention, the decision to do something. Now, whether that translates into an externally observable action or not that externally observable action, that's now the matter of the thing. The form is internal, many times invisible. Think of a human being as the planet Earth. So the planet Earth has tectonic plates. The tectonic plates are always in motion, according to what geologists tell us. The motion is, granted, it's very slow and it takes centuries for them to move, maybe eons even, but the point is they're always constantly in motion. From time to time, We become aware of this motion because there is an earthquake or some kind of tremor or something. We see the results of that motion from time to time. But that is not that not the fact that we don't experience earthquakes or tremors does not mean that the tectonic plates are not in motion. Similarly with a human being has certain interior motions. This is where virtue relies formally. He's always has a preparedness of mind, a readiness, an internal default setting to do something which is good. Good where? Now, the good where depends on the circumstances that arise outside of him. So, for instance, if a person is, let's say, is Abraham and is supposed to be the father of a great nation, right? Then there is no way on earth it makes sense for him to practice virginity because he's supposed to be the father of a great nation. He's supposed to have, like, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of descendants. So it doesn't make sense for him not to have children. That does not mean, so that means externally, he is going to have to get married, he is going to have children. But that does not mean that internally, he is not prepared to sacrifice all sexual pleasure for the sake of the divine will, for the sake of what God wants. Abraham was internally prepared to do this. If God had told him to do it, he would have done it. But God told him to do something else. So that's what it means in terms of the circumstances. So if Abraham was a planet Earth, the tectonic plates that are moving is always prepared, always ready to do whatever it takes to love God and to love his neighbor. Now, externally, the circumstances were, listen, man, you got to become the father of a great nation. So you have to have not just one wife, but two wives and have huge number of well, he didn't have a huge number of children, but his descendants became many. But you get the point that it's got, and this again, remember we spoke about the idea of decree of heroic virtues, like how a person can be canonized and said to have lived, practiced all the virtues to a heroic degree, and yet you read their life and you realize this person was bedridden all their lives. They were just sick in bed all their lives. How on earth did they feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those who are sick or in prison? How did they do all of those things? These are the heroic virtues of generosity, of charity, etc. How did they do that if they're just stuck in bed all the time? Because they were sick. The circumstances did not permit them. The circumstances, the external circumstances did not arise. However, internally, they had this preparedness of mind. Which is why, when it comes to the canonization of saints in the Roman Catholic Church, the biggest, one of the hardest main obstacles, precisely is to prove this first point, that they had the preparedness of mind to practice all the virtues. So once a person is declared to have practiced all the virtues to a heroic degree, that's like a major hurdle that's been overcome. After that, it's just a question of a miracle here and a miracle there, and kind of good to go. I'm simplifying the process greatly, but it's to drive home the point. Objection number 3, further, every virtue is recovered by penance, but virginity is not recovered by penance. Wherefore Jerome says other things God can do, but he cannot restore the virgin after her downfall. Therefore, seemingly virginity is not a virtue. The reply to this objection is virtue can be recovered by penance as regards that which is formal in virtue. You see why this idea of what's formal in a virtue and what's material in a virtue is so important? So this means that even if a person says, takes a vow of virginity, and then they break that vow of virginity due to various circumstances, that means through penance, they can once again formally recommit themselves to being virgins in the sight of God. And God accepts that. Now, in terms of their physical flesh, God is not going to, he cannot undo what happened to them physically. And this is what St. Thomas says further on as regards the matter of virginity. There is that which can be miraculously restored by God, namely the integrity of the organ, which we hold to be accidental to virginity. Well, there is something else which cannot be restored even by miracle, namely that one who has experienced venereal lust should cease to have had that experience. For God cannot make that which is done not to have been done, as stated in the first part. We've hit the 20-minute mark. I'm trying really hard to stick to the 20-minute mark. And so we'll end this conversation there. You can read the replies to objection 4 and objection 5. They're rather straightforward, and they sufficiently reply to the objections. And we'll see you in the next episode, where we shall be discussing whether virginity is more excellent than marriage. Very interesting question. Looking forward to it.